everybody a few reminders and just some background. As a reminder, everyone should mute themselves unless they want to speak or ask a question. People are always free to speak up, ask a question, make a comment at any point. Unfortunately, I can't share the screen and see everybody at once, so don't wait for me to call on you. If you have something to say, just jump into it. And finally, as always, the source sheet is made in advance. So starting this week, actually, we announced, or really starting last week, I put the source sheet up in advance for those who want to maybe look at it or prepare a little in advance. And going forward in the future, there's a link on the top of the Stanton Street website for this source sheet, for any shiur, any class. People want to review a recording of the class, of the source sheet, whatever it is. That's all going to be up on the website, easily accessible under the resources link. So look for that going forward. So just some house cleaning things before we kick off the shiur. So we left off with the Parsha, of course, up to Parshat Mishpatim. And if anyone wanted to venture a one-word explanation, what's Parshat Mishpatim about? What happens in Mishpatim?
Laws.
Yeah.
Laws.
Perfect. It is a very aptly named Parsha. We talked a little bit actually about how Parshiot get their names in the drasha this past Shabbat. It's a very aptly named Parsha because Mishpatim, which literally means laws, seems to be this weird, unaffiliated, not connected list of just random laws, random halachot, random ethical laws, ritual laws, mainly ethical, mainly interpersonal, but some of the ritual, some of the religious laws sprinkled in there. We know it's all religious law, of course, but some of the ritual laws sprinkled in there. And it's a little bit surprising because, first of all, Mishpatim presents to us one of the first divergencies, one of the first times we break away from narrative. Until now, the Torah is basically straight up in a story. We start with creation, we tell the story of the first man, the story of the forefathers. From there, we get into the story of the Jews in Egypt, story of the Jews receiving the Torah. This is the first time in the Torah that we really experience something that will become more common later on in the Torah. And that is just straight up law. The Torah just listing laws and telling us what God said to do. So this is the first taste of that, so that's significant. And in its own right, I think there's a lot to that. That last Parsha, recently, the last chapter of the Torah, we received the Torah, we received the Ten Commandments, and then afterwards we get this long list of laws. It's fascinatingly, actually, it's good Jacob's here, not this exact same brand as Sephardic, but Rabbi Shema from the Syrian community actually has an interesting theory in his book on the Parsha, where Rabbi Shema points out that to some extent, the random disparate laws given throughout Parshat Mishpatim can sort of map onto the Aseret Dibrot. Almost as if the Aseret Dibrot was like an introduction, like here's revelation, here's a taste, and then immediately afterwards we have it all spelled out in Mishpatim, with actual examples, with actual explication. So that's like an interesting idea to think about in its own right. That before we enter into this covenant with God, we're not just getting the chapter heads, we're not just getting the spark notes. It's important we actually know what's going on. It's important we get concrete laws, we explicate and we expound on the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments themselves, those are just, 10 mitzvot. We know there's at least another 603 more, debated how many mitzvot, but there's a whole bunch of other mitzvot. So maybe this is an explication or an expansion on revelation. And what we're dealing with here is really, when we're given the Torah, in addition to the chapter heads, in addition to the flashy 10 Commandments, we have this long list of laws. So that's just one possibility put up by Rabbi Shema that I particularly like. There's a whole bunch of other ideas, but I don't really want to focus on the long list of laws tonight. I want to put it out there. I want us all to acknowledge it. It's an important backdrop to understand what's going on tonight. But what I really want to focus on is the culmination of all these laws. What happens at the end when we return to narrative? What is the narrative we find here? And that's where I want to pick up in Shmot Chaf Daled. So as always, for some people who are new, some people have been here before, we'll start by looking at this section together inside, reading the Psukim. Feel free to ask a question, weigh in, whatever it might be. Then after we look at the section inside, we'll expand on some of the questions through either intertextual, looking at other texts, or looking at some other sources, some other themes that get developed through these texts. So we'll start now with Shmot Chaf Daled, the end of Mishpatim. After we get this long list of laws, the Torah has been received, we've gotten a taste of halacha. So it says the Torah now in Exodus 24. El Moshe Amar, to Moshe, God said, Alei al Hashem, Atav Aron, Nadav Avihu, V'Shavim Zivnei Yisrael. So God says to Moshe, arise, ascend, go up the mountain to God. You, Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, Aaron's children, and the 70 elders of Israel. V'shtachavitem mirachok. And you should bow to God from a distance. All right, so Moshe is now commanded that Moshe, having received the Torah previously, is now given another commandment to go up to the mountain and bring with him his brother Aaron, Aaron's children, the Kohanim, and the 70 elders. V'nigash Moshe levado al Hashem. So Moshe himself went up to Hashem. V'heim lo yigashu. But the elders, the Kohanim, etc., they're not allowed to go to the top of the mountain to meet God. They go up partially, but they don't go all the way. The Ha'am and the nation, everybody else, lo ya'alu imo. They also can't ascend. And Moshe went and told the nation all of this. Vayan kol ha'am kol echad v'yomaru. And the whole nation responded and said in one voice, Kol ha'dvarim asher diber Hashem na'asa. Everything God says, we will do. So far, does this sound familiar? This should ring some bells. Because this really resonates, this really reflects what we read together last week's Parsha, for Parshat Yitro. This is very similar, very parallel to the giving of the Torah. We have, again, Moshe and Aaron, we have some amount of leadership going up the mountain, some sort of emphasis, some sort of point being made on division, that the Jewish people don't go up with Moshe. Aaron and the elders go up partially with Moshe, and Moshe goes up all the way on his own. Again, v'igbalta et ha'am, we'll see, some focus on division, and some focus on a mountain, going up a mountain, some public display on a mountain. It seems very similar to Har Sinai, and that's something we'll speak about soon. V'yichtov Moshe et kol divrei Hashem. Moshe wrote down all of the words of Hashem. V'yashkem b'boker, and he woke up in the morning. V'yivem mizbeach tachat har, and he built an altar on the bottom of the mountain. U'shteim esrei matzeva l'shneim esrei shiftei Yisrael. And he built 12 matzevot, 12 pillars. We know that a mizbeach, an altar, is multiple stones. A matzeva is one stone, one big stone. So Moshe built 12 matzevot, 12 pillars, 12 stones, connected to parallel the 12 tribes. Interesting to think about why the 12 tribes need to be paralleled here. We saw by Matan Torah, by the giving of the Torah earlier, there's no talk about 12 different pillars paralleling the 12 tribes. Something interesting to think about. Why should it be that here the 12 tribes will be emphasized? Hopefully something that we'll get to together tonight. So we pick up now in Pasuk Hey, source 5, verse 5. V'yishlach et na'arei b'nei Israel, and he, Moshe, sent the youth of Israel, v'ya'alu olot, and they offered olot. Olot, of course, being a type of sacrifice, an animal sacrifice, that's fully burnt, fully offered to God, the most holy of sacrifices. So the youth of Israel were sent to offer olot. V'yizbechu zvachim, and they slaughtered other sacrifices, shlamim. These are the peace offerings that those who offer it get to eat a part of. So the olot are fully burned, the shlamim are partially eaten. LaHashem parim, to God, bulls. So they sacrifice all these bulls, they sacrifice all these animals to God, the na'arei b'nei Israel, the youth of the children of Israel. So just want to point out the very interesting period of time we're operating in right now. Do we have Kohanim? Do we have priests? No. The priesthood isn't established until chapters later, when we have the construction of the Mishkan, the construction of the tabernacle. And then we say, and here are some of the sacrifices that Aaron and his children are going to have to do. They are in charge of the temple. But that didn't happen yet. None of that happened yet. We don't have a priesthood. So who offers the sacrifices? So weirdly, and this is something hopefully we'll discuss also, we'll get back to, we have this term na'arei, the young people of Israel. They're sent out to give offerings. So something to think about, something we'll get back to. Who are these na'arei b'nei Israel, these youth of Israel? And why are they being sent out to offer sacrifices as part of this ceremony, procession, whatever's going on here? All right, so that's one question we have. What's going on with the Na'arei Yisrael? That brings us to verse Vav, verse 6. Yikach Moshe chatzi hadam. Moshe collects the blood, and he takes half of the blood that was from the animals that were slaughtered, v'yasem ba'aganot, and he puts it in an agana, in a basin, I guess. We think of the word aguna like in modern Hebrew to mean like either weighed down or chained. It can mean like an anchor or like some sort of heavy, large basin. So Moshe puts the blood in a basin. But in half of the blood, he throws on the mizbeach, as is typical. Ritual blood, ritual sacrifice usually culminates in sprinkling the blood of the animal on the mizbeach, on the altar. So half of it goes into a basin, half of it goes onto the altar. V'yikach sefer habrit. And now Moshe takes this book, which we're supposed to know what it is. It's called the Sefer HaBrit, the Book of the Covenant. Unclear, is that all of the Torah? Is that the laws that we just said Moshe wrote down? Remember, we just said Moshe wrote down the laws, the Mishpatim that God commanded him. So unclear exactly what the Sefer HaBrit is. But whatever exactly this book, this work is, Moshe takes this work, Yikach Sefer HaBrit, V'yikra boznei ha'am, and he reads it to the children of Israel. V'yomru kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh v'nishma. And they say, everything we'll do, everything you say, we will do and we will listen. So again, this should sound so familiar. We already have the Jewish people say na'aseh v'nishma. We already have them say na'aseh. Now they say na'aseh v'nishma again. We have this repetition that's so resonant with Har Sinai. So I think one of the things we should be thinking as we read this story is if this is so similar to Har Sinai, if it parallels it, or if it copies it, why is it here? Why did it happen? Do we need a second Har Sinai? Or maybe, is this even a second Har Sinai? Is this a second retelling of Har Sinai? One of the questions we'll discuss together. But whenever we have some redundancy in the Torah, it should stand out to us. So methodologically, just to highlight here, we're having a lot of similar language and similar themes. We're hitting upon both within the Perek. We already have the Jewish people saying Na'aseh, and again, they have to say Na'aseh v'nishma. Why? And additionally, earlier, we know the Jewish people are accepted the Torah in Har Sinai. So what is going on? What is the scene with all of this repetition surrounding a ritual at Har Sinai around the Sefer HaBrit, some book of covenant? So that's part of the large goal of what we'll try to tackle. All right, Pasuk Chet, verse 8. Mikach Moshe et hadam. Moshe takes the blood, v'yizrok al ha'am, and he throws it on the nation. Side note, this is gross. Moshe takes the blood from all these animals, he just throws it onto the nation. Happens to be, it's a machloket between Onkelos and a lot of the other commentaries, Rashi and others. Does that mean that Moshe literally threw the blood on the nation? Or, much like on Yom Kippur, the Torah tells us that you should throw blood on the Aron, on the Ark of the Covenant, you should throw blood on the Parochet, on the curtain, and there too, we don't actually throw it on it, we just sprinkle it in front of it. We throw it on the ground in front of it. So Rashi and many others say it doesn't mean they actually threw it on the Jewish people, but rather it means that the blood was thrown in front of the Jewish people, not physically on them. This actually has a little bit of significance halachically, because this discussion comes up surrounding conversion, because this whole story and these psukim end up being the basis for the halachot of conversion. So maybe based on whether you think that the blood was actually sprinkled on the Jewish people, it might actually have some sort of impact on what you think the goal of conversion is, etc. It comes up. But just as an interesting point, it sounds gross, not so clear if it's literal. The blood was sprinkled on behalf of the Jewish people, on literally the Jewish people. But Moshe sprinkles the blood on the Jewish people. And what we see here is something that's actually pretty typical of covenants in the Torah. And I'm no expert, so I will not say this definitively, but I would just assume, because a lot of the Torah covenants are based off of covenants of the time that make sense, probably like a generally Mesopotamian or ancient Near East type of covenant, that you have a sacrifice of animals, much like we know the original covenant with Abraham, the Brit B'nai B'Tarim, when Abraham had to separate and cut animals in pieces. Similarly, we have a sacrifice of animals, we have a focus on their blood, and somehow we have the blood of the animals actually tying together the two parties. Part of it sprinkled on the altar, which represents God, part of it sprinkled on the Jewish people, which is us. So it's like us signing and God signing a contract. We have the blood signing us both together into a contract, into a covenant. So that takes us now to verse 8, in the middle. V'yizrok el ha'am, Moshe throws on the Jewish people, or in front of. V'yomer hinei dam habrit, and he says, here is the blood of the covenant, asher karat Hashem imachem al kol advarim ha'ela, which God has made with you, has written with you today on all these matters. So here's the blood of the covenant, and he throws it on them or in front of them. And then Moshe, Aaron's children, and the elders go up the mountain. And they saw the God of Israel, and underneath his feet, it appeared as if it was stones of sapphire, and like the very being of the sky in purity. One of the weirdest verses in the entire Torah, no doubt. We have what appears to be such like a Nevi'im Achronim, such like a later, mystical conception of God that you don't find in Shemot, much less in Moshe's 5 books anywhere. That the Jewish elders, the Shivim Zakenim, Moshe, and the Kohanim, go up to the mountain of Har Sinai, and they see a physical manifestation, almost, of divine presence. They see sapphire stones. And first of all, of course, we know Chazal and the rabbis and rabbinic literature go crazy trying to explain this. Kabbalistic and mystical literature goes crazy with this. This ends up being the start of a huge other counter-Kabbalistic mystical tradition and contributing to that. But just for our purposes, I really just want to focus on the Pshat. What the heck is going on? So, first of all, opening that up to the crowd. I'll give everybody a second both to take this in, and if anyone has anything they want to say, what is going on with this pasuk?
It says they saw the God of Israel. Again, as if God had a physical body. And there are people, there were rabbis in the Middle Ages who believed that God did have a physical body.
There's definitely deep theological implications here for sure about the physicality of God. But irrespective of whether one wants to take a stance on theology, can one believe God has a body? Very clearly, overall, the Torah doesn't talk this way. Like this stands out because it's unusual to us. So even if one wants to, ask the theological question, I think the methodological question here, the biblical text question here is very striking. Why all of a sudden are we getting so mystical? All right, so we'll back pocket that. That's something else, hopefully. Yeah,
Jacob. It feels very much in line with kind of the logical next step of a grand revelation, right? God theoretically revealed himself on Har Sinai, right? Last week Parshat, and this is kind of all right, now we're ascending and actually being able to actually see the physical manifestation of the revelation.
Beautiful. Jacob is making an amazing point. So just to repeat so everyone heard it, though Jacob said it better than I could. What we see here, this physical manifestation of God is very strange, but continuing with this sense of repetition that we're almost recreating or reliving Har Sinai, we know Har Sinai also had a mystical, divine, physical manifestation of God. The Torah emphasizes this miraculous vision of voices that the Jewish people saw kolot, that they saw some miraculous manifestation of God. So we have almost a parallel here, that we have some supernatural, some miraculous, some unexpected physical manifestation of God, and that flouting of the norms of how things usually works, maybe that's just part of revelation. That's part of what's so crazy about it all, about God coming down to the human world. If you can see voices, maybe you can see a manifestation of God that looks like sapphire. So I think that's a beautiful point, that in many ways this is very strange, but it also is consistent with sort of what we'd expect from earlier, and also thematically ties us to the structure from earlier. We have God giving Moshe commandments. Moshe goes to Aaron, his brother. This time the rest of the Kohanim and the elders get into. They go up the mountain. There's some sort of miraculous vision at the top of the mountain. Everybody can see, or in this case, some of the people can see. And that's going to lead to the foundation for revelation. And that revelation is what really is the significance of our Brit, of our covenant. That we have some sort of special relationship with God as expressed through revelation. Seems very familiar. Great point. I would still say that there's a difference between seeing sounds and hearing a shofar versus God appearing as a man on a sapphire throne. So it still feels really extreme, but I think it's an excellent point that really in context, it's not as bizarre as I'm making it out to be. It's sort of following the model we've seen so far if we take the earlier prakim, the earlier chapter of Har Sinai, as our model for what's going on. Perfect. So that's something that's really going to come to head once we dive a little deeper into our discussion here. So going on from there, from this bizarre pasuk, the El Atzile b'nei Yisrael, and to the lazy amongst the Jews, lo shalach yado. Moshe did not, I guess God in this context, did not send his hand. He did not punish them. V'yechazu et ha'elohim v'yochlu v'yishtu. And they saw God and they ate and drank. So I'm not sure if this is referring to a selection of people amongst the 70 elders, because those were the people who ascended the mountain and saw God. So presumably they're the only ones seeing God here. Or if maybe, even if they're the only people who ascended the mountain, maybe everybody saw a glimpse of God. It's a little bit ambiguous when the pasuk in verse 10 just says v'yiru, they saw. So we don't know if the they is the elders previously mentioned or all of the Jewish people. But what we definitely have here is some sort of statement that there were lazy people, there were bad people amongst the Jews who ate and drank and deserved to be punished by God. It was disrespectful or somehow inappropriate to be eating and drinking. But nonetheless, lo shalach yado. God restrained himself and did not punish them. Really weird. What is going on? What do you mean people were eating and drinking? Why would people eat and drink? How could they feel the comfort, or how could they feel it's appropriate to eat and drink at Har Sinai? Well, God is revealing himself on a sapphire throne. What is going on in this verse? We definitely have to understand that. Well, how could people be eating? Why aren't we really being told about it? What does it mean God didn't send his hand? All right.
Avatzi lay Bnei Yisrael means the lazy ones of the children of Israel. I mean, I don't know if it means that. I know it. It's
Literally like
Atzilut means being lazy. But it can't possibly be the Ziknei Yisrael that just went up the mountain. They were anything but lazy. They were mountain climbers.
Also a good point, yeah. But yeah, despite that, if you look in Sepharia, for example, this is just the Sepharia translation, which I think is GPS. In verse 11, how do they define it? The leaders of the Israelites. They don't even bother explaining like lazy. They just say, "Oh, Atzilei is the leaders," and they just take it figuratively. So clearly, like some people just think that, but you're just highlighting. Well, how are they being called the lazy people? What is going on here? Yeah. Very strange.
And how could a revelation, in Sinai, no one was eating or drinking at that moment. I mean, they were so afraid. Here they're having a picnic.
Yeah, right? It's bizarre. Absolutely bizarre. All right, great. So this is another question that hopefully, wow, we're promising big in this year. If we come through and answer all these things, that's going to be huge. Let's aim for like an 85. If we get like 85%, we're going to do it here. All right, so now just to finish up here, we're in Pasuk Yud Bet. But Yomer Hashem and Moshe, Hashem says to Moshe, Alei alai, you go up even higher. Moshe, ascend to me. Ascend to the top. Alei alai hahara, go up to me on this mountain. V'hayesham, and be there. V'tnelach et luchot ha'even, and I'll give you the luchot ha'even, the commandments of stone. The Torah, the Torah, ha-mitzvah, commandment. Asher k'tavti lahorotam, which I have written for teaching, for giving over. So he says, I'm going to give you the Torah, the luchot, and the mitzvot. Interesting to think about why God explicates all of those. We already saw Moshe get the Sefer Dibrot, right? The 10 Commandments. And those were described as luchot. So are these different luchot? Are these the same luchot? Is Torah and mitzvah a colon, a comma, a semicolon? I don't really know grammar that well, so I don't know the difference between all those. But is Torah and mitzvah just an explanation of what the luchot ha'even are? Or are these three totally different things God gave? God gave luchot, and he gave Torah, and he gave mitzvah. Unclear. We have an ambiguous phrase where God promises a lot and we're not exactly sure what it means. Then Vayakim Moshe v'Yoshua misharto. So Moshe and Yoshua go up. Vayal Moshe el har ha'Elohim. And Moshe ascends the mountain. But as the Kinim Amar, and to the elders he said, Shvulanu v'zeh ad asher nashuv aleichem. Stay here until I return to you. V'yinei Aron v'chori mechem, mi bal dvarim yigash aleihem. And behold, Aaron and Chor are with you. So, mi bal dvarim yigash aleihem. A very strange thing to part. Let anyone who has any matter come to approach them. Very weird thing almost. It's like Moshe's telling the elders he doesn't trust them. He's about to leave. He says, let any questions be asked to Aaron and Chor. Okay. I guess he probably has good reason to establish a hierarchy. You need to appoint someone in charge when you're not there. So the hierarchy establishes is that Aaron and Chor should be in charge. Fine. Moshe goes up and is covered by cloud. And God's presence covers our Sinai. And the cloud covers Moshe for 6 days. And God called to Moshe on the 6th day from the cloud. And now we have another reference to something physical in appearance of God. And this is much more in line with what Jacob was referencing, the physical manifestations of the mountain. That Marei Kvod Hashem, the appearance of God's glory, was ke'esh ochelet. It was like a consuming fire, barosh har, on the top of the mountain. Sorry about that. There, in Bnei Israel, to the eyes of the Israelites. So again, the Jewish people observe some physical manifestation of divinity. Moshe comes from the cloud, v'yal al-har, and goes up the mountain. Moshe b'har arbim yom v'arbim laila. And Moshe is in the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So I think this is already clear just from reading through it. But it's really confusing when Moshe goes up. God tells Moshe to tell the elders and Aaron to go up. And then Moshe tells Aaron and the elders to go up. And then God tells Moshe to go up. And then Moshe goes up. And then the cloud covers Moshe. And then the Psukim say, and then Moshe goes up, and he's up for 6 days. And then it says that Moshe goes up, and he's up for 40 days. We have a lot of repetition, a lot of confusion here. It's very unclear what exactly is happening here. But beyond just the confusion or the clarity of what's the timeline? When is Moshe going up? When is Moshe coming down? There's really a broader question at the heart of this. What's the timeline of this story in the broader Tanakh, in the broader Shemot context, the broader Exodus context? Because as we pointed out, the story seems really repetitive. First of all, it mentions Moshe getting the luchot, getting the commandments. And we know that happened in Yitro. We already read that last week. So is he getting them again a second time? Is this a retelling that's happening concurrently? And then beyond that, we have all these similar details, like the Jewish people affirming the Torah, saying na'aseh, saying na'aseh v'nishma. And these details are also sort of repeated twice, almost as if there's like a second doubling. There's two Har Sinais being mentioned here. It's very confusing. Are we dealing with a second Har Sinai later? So this question of chronology, obviously, is very at the forefront of the sugya, very at the forefront of the discussion of this section of the Torah. And it comes up throughout the literature, throughout the rabbinic literature, Chazal, Rashi, etc. So just as an example, Rashi, looking at the seeming repetition or redundancy here, he looks at this section and he says in source 2, Parsha zu nemra kodem aseret dibrot. It must be that this section was said before the giving of the Ten Commandments. B'daled b'sivan nemra lo aleh. On the 4th of Sivan, that's when God told Moshe to go up the mountain. So says Rashi, we see God tell Moshe go up a mountain. Moshe gets luchot. When did that happen? We know that happened at Har Sinai. So Rashi says, even though the simple textual read here is that this is all occurring later, that after Har Sinai, God tells Moshe all this material, nonetheless, Rashi waves the simple reading, waves the simple explanation of the Torah here, and he says it must be the Torah is presenting things out of order. This whole story is way too parallel, way too similar to the story of Har Sinai. It must be that it happens right before Har Sinai. And when we read at the end of our chapter that Moshe goes up and gets the luchot, that's just retelling Har Sinai. Just the second time the Torah tells over the same story. And if that's the case, what would be interesting, and a lot of the work that there would be to do, would be to think about why are there differences? What are the differences between the first telling of Har Sinai and the second telling of Har Sinai? And why might those differences exist? And that's a really fruitful shiur, but that's not what we're going to do tonight. But we see, at least from Rashi, that there's a very good reason, based on Chazal, and for time's sake we can skip it, but it's just the Gemara in source 3. The Gemara, we'll read it inside even. Rashi's based on the Gemara here. We'll look at it inside together in source 3. The Gemara in Shabbos 88a says as follows. Tashma Rabbi Yossi Omer. Rabbi Yossi says, B'sheni ala Moshe v'yarad. On the 2nd of Sivan, Moshe went up and descended the mountain. That's when he first went up and God tells him to go back down. B'shlishi ala v'yarad. On the 3rd of Sivan, he goes up and goes back down again. B'revi yarad v'shuv lo Allah. On the 4th, he goes down and he doesn't go back up. And if that's the case, and Moshe doesn't go back up after the 4th of Sivan, then when he later receives the Torah, where is he coming down from? We're missing one ascent. Ela b'revi ala v'yarad. On the 4th, he went up and down. B'chamishi b'ana mizbeach. On the 5th day, he built a mizbeach. V'hikrav lo korban, and offered sacrifices. B'shishi lo haya lo pnai. On the 6th day, he had no free time. My love, why not? And then the Gemara goes into discuss it. But what Rashi draws from this is that the Gemara says that on the 5th of Sivan, namely the day before the Torah was given, Moshe builds a Mizbeach and offers sacrifices. And we just read, that's from our section, that the building of the Mizbeach and Moshe going up and down, all of that takes place according to this Gemara on the 4th and the 5th of Sivan, right before Moshe gets the Torah. So it says Rashi, based on this Gemara, that what we have here is a second retelling of the story of Har Sinai. And just to draw this out, in source 4 here, I just brought what we looked at together last week, the story of Har Sinai. And we see that there's a lot of obvious parallels. We see that there's a mention of, like we said before, of miraculous visuals, be it fire consuming the mountain, God himself, or here we see kolotu vrakim, these sounds and thunderous noises. We know that there's Moshe going up and down a mountain. We mentioned before that Aaron, and there's some sort of representation for Aaron in the priesthood. They go up with Moshe. Again, they go up with Moshe. And of course, most simply, there's the luchot. Moshe comes down a mountain, and he gets luchot. So we see the parallels are obvious, and we can understand why perhaps one would want to say that what we're dealing with here is a retelling of an earlier story. Something to think about, and perhaps something we could even answer in our final presentation, something in our final answer. Why would this story need to be retold twice? What is the different perspective that is being highlighted here? So that's something to think about and something that hopefully we'll be able to answer as we develop this further. But just on this chronology point, just keeping it local to the small chronology point, we saw that the Gemara in Shabbos seems pretty clearly to say this happens before Matan Torah. Rashi quotes that. But it's actually not so simple, because the Mechilta, the Midrash, commenting on Shmot, commenting on the book of Exodus, points out that this is actually a machloket. It's actually subject to debate, the chronology of this section. So just save us a little time, the Mechilta opens up by more or less saying the same thing as the Gemara in Shabbat, saying that this took place right the day before Moshe received the Torah. If you look in the middle here, it says Shene Emar, as it's written in Exodus 24, our section, our parsha. V'kach Moshe et hadam v'yizrok al ha'am. Moshe took the blood and sprinkled it on the nation. Amar lahem harei atem kshurim anuvim tfusim. Moshe said to them, you people are anuvim, you're humbled. It's interesting that that this is part of the process, but he said, you people are anuvim and tfusim, you're taken, you're grabbed, you're committed. Anyways, Moshe says you're committed to God, you're kasher, you're toughest, you're grabbed. Tomorrow, come and consummate this commitment and accept the mitzvot. So what we see very clearly is, when does this take place? When is Shemot Chaf Daled, Exodus 24? The day before they receive the Torah. Because Moshe says, Machar, tomorrow, ba'u v'kiblu, go and accept the Torah. Rabbi Yossi says, Bo b'yom nasa kol ma'asem. No. That stuff happened the day of Matan Torah, afterwards. After Moshe is given the Torah, he then goes and builds a mizbeach and offers sacrifices and does all of these things. In other words, what is presented here is not a second retelling of Har Sinai, but a later second ritual that takes place immediately after Har Sinai. So according to Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda, interesting to think, is this the same Rabbi Yossi that's quoted as in the Gemara Shabbos as saying that all this took place before Matan Torah, and there's some transmission issue here? That's a different question. But nonetheless, we have Rabbi Yossi on the other side of the game here. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, saying that no, this didn't happen before Har Sinai. Our story took place according to the literal chronology of the Torah. Har Sinai happened in Parshat Yitro last week. And our story takes place a second time, separate instance of a covenant with God on a mountain, immediately after Har Sinai in this week's Parsha. And just to highlight that this machloket amongst rabbinic interpretations between a midrash and a Gemara is really still a live debate in the Rishonik and the later rabbinic interpretation. We see that while Rashi quotes the Gemara in Shabbat, Sforno very clearly seems to take the stance presented in the Mechilta that this story actually takes place according to the simple chronological order, takes place after Har Sinai. See in source Vav, the Sforno says, Vel Moshe Amar Sheyaleh. So Moshe is told to go up on the mountain. K'moshe Yad Alav Kodem Matan Torah Ba'amro Lech Reid Valita Atav Aronimach. That God is repeating it just like God commanded him earlier before Matan Torah. In other words, says the Sforno, this is repetitive of what happened earlier, but it's not taking place then. Earlier, God told Moshe to go up and down, so to here, God tells Moshe, go up the mountain, go down the mountain. So he doesn't address the question of why God would make Moshe do this twice, but he very clearly says this is a separate instance that just seems similar, that just parallels what took place before. So what we have here now is clearly some sense, some desire to tie the covenant that's taking place here, what's known as the Brit Agunot, because of these unusual basins, these heavy basins full of blood, to tie this Brit Agunot, this covenant of the basins, to Har Sinai, to the giving of the Torah. And we totally understand why. It's very similar. First of all, geographically, position-wise in the Torah, it takes place right afterwards. We just read about Har Sinai. But also it's super similar. Moshe is given a bunch of laws, in this case, the laws of Mishpatim, not necessarily Dibrot. He's told to go up and down a mountain. There's all this flashy ritual, and God comes to the mountain. There's some amazing covenant where the Jewish people have sacrifices and blood sprinkling, and it culminates in Moshe having a new book, the Sefer Brit, and a new covenant with God and the Jewish people. That sounds very parallel to Har Sinai, and it makes sense to parallel the two. But what the commentaries and what even the rabbis in the Midrash here are pointing out is that while the textual parallel, the thematic parallel, is very appealing, it makes a lot of sense, if we're going to parallel Har Sinai, we have to address the question of redundancy. Why would we say the same thing twice? So I think in part because of that pressure, because of the desire of not being redundant, in addition to the desire to maintain the pshat, to keep the simple text, we have a large presentation of Rishonim, a large group of rabbinic authorities, not following the pshat of the Bavli, the simple position put forth in the Talmud, but going with this lesser-known Mechilta position that wants to say that the Torah is written in a simple order here, and what we're dealing with here is a second repetitive instance of a Brit, of a covenant after Har Sinai.
I hate to interrupt your thread because you're clearly going somewhere, and I don't know what, I don't know what it is, but I'm not sure why it's such a great question, because the first Torah was perhaps everything, the full Torah, oral and written, were all given up there at the first time, but maybe not. Maybe it was an outline. Maybe it was whatever it was. Maybe it was too much to digest at once. But certainly here, Mishpatim is telling you that this is now, I'm going to give you some Gemara on it, or I'm going to give you some, fleshed out laws that you didn't have before. So why shouldn't they be given the same way? If this is a second covenant, this is, I gave you the one before, and now I'm giving you a version that will spell that out. That's one reason I don't think it's a great question. Another reason, look who's saying it's not a great question, but the other thing is that it's not strange that God insists upon being met somewhere, and that mountains are very often where gods reside, as it were. So again, I don't see why we're, now, that's why I said I don't want to interrupt your thread, because I know you will answer this with some perspective. So, but the question is bothering me a bit. Having interrupted, can I just read you? Because I do always think in a very Jungian way that humans think in certain ways, whoever we are. And so the Torah tells Jews how to think, or tells the way Jews think or will understand, but the world gets some of the same messages. We have, of course, the Midrash that Hashem did go around and tried everybody, and people remembered some things. So in Blue Sapphire, in ancient times, and I think continuing on, did represent mental focus and order, inner vision and psychic awareness. And in chakra theory, and I always think there's connections between the later Rabbanim and the Indian, I don't mean the Indian, but the Eastern thought, because the Silk Road, but that wouldn't read into the Torah. That would just say, again, that, the humans think in related ways. That in chakra theory, sapphire is said to help open the third eye to receive wisdom and insight, and to communicate that vision to others.
Interesting.
So
I think for sure you're definitely touching upon something very, very, very true. For sure true that across visions of prophecy or revelation, there's this very large emphasis on symbolism. Whereas I would say most of the time, our mode of reading scripture, reading Torah, is literalism. The Torah means what it says, mediated by Torah Sheba'al Peh and all that stuff. When it comes to prophecy, like we'll see, especially in like Nevi'im, prophets will just get a vision of something, and that's symbolic of something else or interpretive of something else. So I think it's an interesting point that this idea of a sapphire throne, once we're dealing with this like symbolic vision of a physical manifestation of God, there could be some significance to that sapphire. Interesting to hear that there is Vedic traditions already, or Far Eastern traditions, that gave sapphire some sort of significance of wisdom or insight. Of course, that would make a lot of sense with the association with God or revelation, giving of the Torah. But that's a really interesting point. But to your first point, I hear your point that perhaps this is just how tradition's transmitted, and this is the formula. So we have a lot of Torah, so we have to do it twice. Maybe I would still say it's a little strange to do it twice, one right after the other. Like God couldn't just do the whole thing once. He couldn't get the whole ritual across with one.
But that was kind of my point, to equate the two. I mean, I'm thick in this discussion with somebody else who's writing a book that needs a great deal of, by telling him, you're wrong. But I'm thick in it. And it's so essential, the point that I'm making to him, and I think that we all would agree, that you cannot know anything about the written Torah without the oral law. That's what we are based on. And so here, that we're given in back-to-back chapters exactly that balance.
So that's fair. I think that's like a beautiful idea. There's like a little, basically the idea is that there's concise, terse Torah, either Torah Shebechtav or some sort of more specific Torah. Then there's an expansion, either oral tradition or just, the details of law. And what we have here is really some sort of dual covenant that's trying to cover both parts of that. I think that's beautiful. That's very similar to the direction we're ultimately going to head in. So I keep that in mind, because I think the reason you don't find this difficult is because you've already intuited what we're going to try and prove in our answer. So beautiful. So keep that in mind. But I would just want to point out that if you buy my point, and even if you don't buy my point that this is a little strange, what for sure stands out is something that I first learned when I was in yeshiva with Professor Yoni Grossman. And he pointed out that while there's a lot of thematic parallels here between Har Sinai and this story, and it's juxtaposed to Har Sinai, so we might think it's similar to Har Sinai, surprisingly, there's actually not that many textual parallels with Har Sinai. It's only thematic. The idea of a mountain, the idea of getting the Torah, these are all themes or ideas that are very similar. But there actually is one other part of the Torah where there's a very clear textual parallel, really hard to deny even. And that is the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. Seems completely out of left field. But if you look at our section, you look at the Akedah, it's hard to miss the parallel. So just to run through them quickly. In source 7, we have Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac, the Akedah. So just some throwaways. Here in verse Gimel, V'yashkem Abraham b'boker, Abraham gets up very early in the morning. Verse Daled, verse 4 here, V'yashkem b'boker, Moshe gets up very early in the morning. Continuing in these parallels, right? We have in the Akedah, V'yar et hamakom merachok, that Abraham sees the place of the Akedah, sees where he's supposed to go from far away. Whereas here, we have V'yiru et Elohei Yisrael. They see, by Yiru, they see God. They see the divinity. In one case, it's seeing the holy place. In another case, it's seeing God. Don't worry, there's much more explicit parallels than that. That's a little weak, I'll admit. We have Shvu lechem po mechamor. Abraham tells his Na'arim, tells the young people who are with him to sit here with their donkey, wait for us. Shvu lechem po mechamor, v'ani v'nar ne'lecha ad ko, v'nishtacha v'neshuv alechem. Wait here and we'll return to you. And what do we see? Moshe is told to tell the elders who go up with him that they should shvu lanu b'zeh ad asher neshuv alechem. Wait here until I return to you. Again, another clear textual parallel. They keep coming. It's crazy. First of all, Hanar, we have this emphasis on the youth who are accompanying Abraham, and we pointed out how unusual it was that who is being described as offering the sacrifices that accompany this Brit Agunot? Na'arei b'nei Israel, the youth of the children of Israel. Some sort of focus here on youth. Also, we have here, Vayiven Sham Abraham et Mizbeach. Abraham builds an altar. We mentioned that Moshe builds an altar. We have, perhaps even more compelling, that after the angel shows up on the scene and tells Abraham not to sacrifice Isaac, not to harm him, what does the angel say? Al tishlach yadecha al hanar. Don't send your hand out against the youth. And we know what it was, that peculiar phrase that God said to the Atzilei b'nei Israel, to the lazy amongst Israel, Lo shalach yado. Don't send out your hand. Exact same formulation for physical harm. Don't send out your hand, don't harm. Some sort of statement of God's withdrawal, of God's restraint, clearly paralleling them. And then perhaps finally, one of the most striking, because of how unnecessary it was, we see that what's the focus of the Akedah? What's the object that Avram's about to do it with, that the dramatic focus is on? The ma'achelet. Not just the knife, but the ma'achelet, the consuming knife, this dramatic knife. And now, of course, when we turn to our story, we don't have a ma'achelet, but what we do have is an eish ochelet, a consuming fire on top of the mountain. So whereas Abraham is going into the Akedah, trying to sacrifice Isaac on top of a mountain with his ma'achelet, we have here a scene of the Jewish people on top of a mountain with the ochelet, with a consuming flame. So just to review a little bit, we have waking up early in the morning, we have commanding people to wait around for you, we have similar language of shlach yad, of physical harm, we have the construction of Mizbeach followed by sacrifices, we have v'shtachadi temerachok, bowing from a distance, we have this emphasis on the distance and the presence of God from a distance in the Akedah. So we have a clear parallel here between the Akedah and the story of the Brit Agunot. And that just has to beg a question. What's going on? Why do we have this parallel between the Akedah and the story of the Brit Agunot? Why would I think the binding of Isaac has anything to do with the second later retelling of the Har Sinai, of the Sinaitic covenant? So to try and answer that, I just want to focus on one little peculiar point, and hopefully that'll open up a little bit the themes of what's going on here. So we drew attention before, and we'll just try and keep respectful of time, so I'll try to wrap this up in 10 minutes. But we drew attention before to this peculiarity that in Pasuk Yud Bet, verse 12, no, I remembered the verse wrong. Well, whatever verse it is, in one of the psukim, we have a description of the youth of Israel sacrificing the Pasuk Hey, verse 5, sorry. In verse 5 here, we have a description of the youth of Israel. The youth of Israel are sacrificing the sacrifices in the scene. And we pointed out how unusual it was. Youth are never used in this way. That's not usually what it means. In fact, actually, Ramban specifically asks, what does that mean, youth? This is like a really unusual thing. Like, this is not what we usually see the youth doing. Like, the Rishonim, the commentators, are also attuned to this peculiar use of na'arei, of the youth, in a sacrificial role. So perhaps because of that, picking up on that, we see that Onkelos here, Onkelos in his Aramaic translation, one of the earliest commentaries we have in the Torah, he translates na'ar, not literally, but rather as bochrei b'nei Israel, the firstborn of Israel. And this makes a lot of sense, because as we pointed out, this is before Aaron and his sons are given the kahuna, the priesthood. There's no Levite priesthood yet. So as we know, the priesthood in general culture of the time, and intended initially for the Jewish people, was represented by the firstborn of every family. That was the priest. The firstborn, the Bechor, should be the priest. So of course they're going to be the ones doing the sacrifices. So here, Nar means firstborn. And Rashi follows with Onkelos. Everybody follows Onkelos. Nar clearly here means firstborn. But if that's the case, why just not say firstborn? Why not just say Bechor? It's very strange. So Ramban picks up on this as well, as we pointed out. The Ramban says, Nar b'nei Yisrael hema b'chorot, k'divrei Onkelos. These are the firstborns. Ki hema ma'alim ha'olot v'shlamim. Because the firstborn were in charge of offering sacrifices on behalf of their family. Lo yadati lama yechana b'chorot b'lashon na'arei. And I have no idea why the firstborn were described with the language of youth. Ulai ba'avor she'izkir zakenim, shehem atzilei b'nei Yisrael. Maybe because it mentioned the elders who are the leaders of the Jewish people. Kara b'chorot na'arim. So therefore, it called the firstborns the youngers. It's just contrasting to the elders and the youngers. I think this should appear to all of us very, very weak. Weak explanation for why the Torah would use this peculiar formulation of na'arei, of youth. So I want to propose that what we have here is as follows. We have a clear parallel to the Akedat Yitzchak, to the moment where Avraham showed he was willing to sacrifice his son to God. And I think what we're trying to do here is to try and recreate a similarly devotional, covenantal, significant act in Jewish history. We're trying to create a second experience of the Akedah, but instead of it just being Abraham, this is now the whole Jewish people are now involved in this Akedah. They're all a part of it. But of course, as we know, the Akedah is symbolic. It's about our willingness to sacrifice anything, even our sons. We're not really sacrificing our sons. So in this Akedah, in this recreation, what do we have? Every family sends their Bechor, their firstborn beloved son, to give a sacrifice symbolically in their place, recognizing both that their son is committed to God, their son is sacrificing to God, an act of kahuna, of priesthood, giving over, being makdish, and sanctifying their own child as a servant of God. Of course, a dedication and a sacrifice to God itself. But also, the child is offering a sacrifice in his own place. Ki'ilu, like the Akedah, where the ram was offered in Isaac's place. Every family, every member of the Jewish community has to go through an Akedah-like experience here. They have to offer a sacrifice, see God, experience a revelation similar to the Akedah. And that's why they're called Na'arei, to draw that parallel and that emphasis to the Na'arim, to the youth who are at the heart of the Akedah story. That over and over again, the Na'arim, Yitzchak is a Nar, is referred to as the Nar, that you shouldn't send your Al Tishlach Yadcha El Hanar. Don't send your hand against the youth. So too here, we're invoking that idea of the youth, because the Bechor, the firstborns here, are supposed to be in place of the Nar, of the youth in the story of the Akedah, of the role of the child who is willing to be sacrificed as part of our deep and close covenant to God. But why do we have a second Akedah story? Why is this tying over the Akedah? So I think this ties into the parallels to Har Sinai. Why this story comes right after Har Sinai. I think this ties in really nicely to what Jeremy, not Jeremy. I'm totally forgetting. Who said before? Who made the point about two different themes here? I'm just blanking on who said it. Did Jeff say that?
Jacob.
Who was it?
Jacob
made the point about. Oh, okay, fine, perfect. Okay. Whoever it was. Huh?
I said I'll take the credit.
Perfect. I'm sorry, I'm just blanking there. Whoever, not important. Whoever it was, nonetheless, that we get to see this idea that there's two different Har-Sinais, there's two different themes that are really being developed here. Two different covenants that were important to give over. It was Richard. Okay, I just remembered. It was Richard. Okay, good. Thank you, Richard. Richard made the point before that we have two different traditions or two different things that we have to include here. So I think similarly, we can say.
I'll deny that.
Huh?
I'll deny that. Give Jacob the credit.
Okay, fine. Either way, we have similarly this idea of two different themes or two different emphases that require two separate covenants to encompass all of it. And I think that's very clear because Har-Sinai, what's the emphasis of Har-Sinai? The fear and trembling. The mountain trembles. Vecharad hahar. The Jewish people tremble. Vecharad ha'am. It's a moment of yirat Hashem, of pure fear, of pure awe. God demonstrates his power, and an expression of fear of that power, we, the Jewish people, tremble at the foot of the mountain. But our relationship to God is not entirely based off of fear. It's not entirely based off of what God can do to us. There's also an element of our relationship with God that's ahavat Hashem, that's love of God. And the relationship of love of God isn't a fear of what he can do of us, a fear of his power or his might, but it's based off the content of a relationship. So first, when it comes to the brit, the covenant of Ava, of love, God first gives us some mitzvot. He gives us some content to love, some material to learn. We know Rambam says Talmud Torah, learning Torah, is an expression of Avat Hashem, of loving God. Because a covenant of learning God doesn't start with the blind Nasev and Nishma. We'll do whatever you say and culminate in the Hatzar to Dibrot. It starts with the mitzvot. It starts with the Talmud Torah, and it culminates in our willingness to sacrifice for Hashem. And that's what we see with the recreation of an Akedah-like experience. Because ultimately the Akedah is our theological model, our biblical model, our archetypal model of Ava, of the extent of love. That Abraham loved God so much, not feared God. He was such a lover of God that he was willing to sacrifice everything, his children. Now I'll point out the one downside to this is that the angel says to Abraham, Ata yadati, now I know, ki arei Elohim ata, that you're a fearer of God. But all the commentators point out how peculiar that verse is, because of course God knew already that Abraham was a fearer of God. And of course, the status of Yirei Elohim was not questionable for Abraham. So there definitely is a Yira component, but I think what we understand more is that the Akedah is coming from a place of experience and relationship. And I think what we're trying to do here is to reconstruct a similarly personal Akedah type experience, because we're trying to instill the Ava, the heart and soul of Judaism, in addition to the Yira, the fear, respect, and awe for God's power. And that merits a second Brit, a second covenant. And I think also this opens up a little bit of the peculiarities of the details. Why is it that we have this weird reversal that by the Akedah, what everybody sees is the place from afar that God has appointed, but here what people see is God himself in person? Because what we have here is a reversal. The Akedah is about how Abraham, the one individual, is willing to go out and do so much because he loves God. But what we have here is what God is willing to do so much for us because he loves us. God is willing to come down to a mountain, to manifest physically, to give over the Torah because he loves us. God is doing something for us. So it's the rectification or the completion of the Akedah. Abraham did his part of the Akedah way back when. God comes and meets us with his part here. And that's the physical manifestation of God we see. It's supposed to parallel the seeing of the Makom Merachok, seeing God's presence, seeing the place we're supposed to go. But here, God is not the viewer. God's not watching Abraham and Yitzchak from afar. The Jewish people are the viewer, watching God from afar. And I think perhaps that also explains how these elders could have made the mistake to eat and drink. How could they possibly eat and drink during Revelation? Because this wasn't a terrifying revelation. This wasn't the revelation of earlier, of charada, of trembling. This was a happy one. This was of rejoicing, out of avat Hashem, out of love and meaning. So what we have here is a second repetition of the model of Yira, and what it does to us is really explicate the depth of the two models of Na'aseh and Nishma that the Jewish people present. Now there's two elements to the Jewish acceptance of Torah. There's the blind faith out of fear or awe, the respect of divinity and power that God represents, the respect for schar v'onesh, reward and punishment, the idea that God is a powerful force in the universe. And for that model, we have Har Sinai, we have charada and trembling, we have flashy fireworks, and most importantly, we have acceptance and submission before we even get to hear what's involved. But in this instance, in Mishpatim, we have the covenant of Ava, of love, of actually learning Torah, of not just fearing God, but knowing what God stands for, what it means to be Jewish, of having content to your identity. So for that, for the Brit of Ava, we need a separate covenant where the content of Torah is put forward and where the Jewish people's role as the viewer, as the ones who are being given a gift, who are being put in a position of appreciation, thanking God for giving them this Torah, that's being emphasized in this Brit, in this covenant. So we see how the parallel between Har Sinai and our story works to parallel the two different elements of giving over the Torah, but the parallel to the Akedah, to the story of the binding of Isaac, fills in the content of what exactly that other element, that other component of Har Sinai, of the covenant of Torah really is. And together they present to us, hopefully, a fully fleshed out covenant where we have both the law and the soul behind the law. So I hope that made sense. I hope I answered some of the questions that we raised together. I'm open to any answers, questions. Richard, did you find that convincing, or would you still rather not ask the question in the first place? I'm open to hear what you thought about it. But otherwise, that's all I have in this point.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good focus way to look at this. I knew you would get there, so I trusted that.
Thank you. And I'm open if anyone has any ideas, either now or if you want to text, call, email me. I think there's no question. It's beyond a shadow of a doubt. We have a parallel to the Akedah here. I think my interpretation of the Akedah, and I think I might have even gotten it from Dr. Grossman when we learned it together to some extent. I think it's only one possible interpretation. So while the parallel seems textually proven, I'm open to the meaning behind it. So feel free to follow up, ask questions, whatever it might be. But in the meantime, thank you everybody for learning with me. I hope to see everybody tomorrow, 7 p.m. There'll be the Tefillah Shir. And then next week, same time, same place, 7 p.m. Tuesday, we'll have Parsha Shir for next week's Parsha.
Oh.
Thank you, everybody. As always, feel free to follow up. Have a good night.
Good night, everyone. Good night, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good night.
Rabbi?
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Rabbi? Okay.